Egyptians, Carians, Hebrews, even his fellow Greeks, it was all the same to him. You turned up, killed who you had to kill, and then joined another expedition, as often as not against the very people who'd just paid you. Today his master was Cambyses of Persia. Yet, not so long ago, he'd fought against the same Cambyses in the army of Egypt. That's how it was in this business. He took another swig of water, allowing his mind to drift back to Thebes, to the last day there, before they'd set out across the desert. He and a friend, Pheidias of Macedon, had taken a skin of beer and crossed Eteru, the great river, to the valley they called the Gates of the Dead, where it was said many great kings were buried. They'd spent the afternoon drinking and exploring, discovering a narrow shaft at the foot of a steep slope of rubble, into which, as a dare, they'd both crawled. Inside, the walls and ceiling had been covered in painted images, and the Greek, pulling out his knife, had begun carving his name into the soft plaster. I, Dimachus, son of Menendez of Naxos, saw these wonders. Tomorrow, I march against the Ammonians. But before he could finish, poor old Pheidias had knelt on a scorpion, letting out an almighty scream and scrabbling out of the shaft like a frightened cat. How he'd laughed. The joke had been on him, however, for Pheidias's leg had swelled to the size of a log, and he'd been unable to march with the army the next day, thus missing 4 weeks of torment in the desert. Poor old Pheidias, lucky old Pheidias more like. He chuckled at the memory. He was dragged from his reverie by the voice of his companion. Dimachus! Hey, Dimachus! What? Look at that, you don't! Up ahead! The Greek lifted his eyes and stared forward along the line of marching troops. They were passing through a broad valley between high dunes, and there ahead, its outline warped by the fierce glare of the midday sun, rose a huge pyramid-shaped rock, its sides so uniform they seemed to have been deliberately carved into that shape. There was something faintly menacing about it, standing silent and alone in the otherwise featureless landscape, and the Greek involuntarily raised his hand to the Isis amulet at his neck, muttering a swift prayer to ward off evil spirits. They marched on for another half-hour, before a halt was called for the midday meal, by which time the Greek's company was almost alongside the rock. He staggered towards it, and slumped down in the sliver of shade at its foot. "How much further?" he groaned. "Oh, Zeus, how much further?" Boys came round with bread and figs, and the men ate and drank. Afterwards, some fell to scoring their names into the surface of the rock. The Greek leaned back and closed his eyes, enjoying the sudden breeze that had come up. He felt the tickle of a fly as it landed on his cheek, the same one he was sure as had been tormenting him all morning. This time he made no attempt to swat it, allowing it to wander back and forth across his lips and eyelids. It took off and landed again, took off and landed, testing his resolve. Still he didn't move, and the insect, lulled into a false sense of security, finally settled on his forehead. With infinite care, the Greek raised his hand, held it for a moment 6 inches from his face, then slammed it violently against his temple. "Got you, you bastard!" he cried, staring down at the remains of the fly smeared across his palm. "At last!" His triumph was short-lived, however, for at that moment a faint murmur of alarm came drifting forward from the rear of the column. "What is it?" he asked, wiping away the fly and standing, hand on sword. "An attack?" "I don't know," said the man beside him. "There's something going on behind us." The hubbub was growing. 4 camels thundered past, their packs trailing in their wake, froth dripping from their mouths. Screams could be heard, and muffled shouting. The breeze, too, was getting stronger, buffeting into his face, making his hair flicker and dance. The Greek shielded his eyes and stared south.